Imagine a gangster whose name echoes less loudly than Al Capone or Lucky Luciano, yet his influence was just as formidable. Welcome to the world of Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, the unsung godfather of Harlem. His life wasn't just a series of skirmishes with the Italian Mafia. It was a story of resilience and leadership in a time when odds were stacked against him. But who was Bumpy Johnson really, and how did he rise to such prominence? Harlem's Godfather, the rise of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. The streets of Harlem in the early 20th century were not just a melting pot of cultures, but a battleground where power and influence were constantly at stake. In this turbulent setting, a figure rose to prominence, not just as a gangster, but as an icon of resilience and a symbol of the African-American struggle. This was Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, the man who would become known as the Godfather of Harlem. Born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson's journey was not one of luxury or privilege. The racial segregation prevalent in the United States at the time shaped his early experiences. Seeking better opportunities, his family moved to Harlem, a neighborhood that promised refuge for African-American families. Little did they know that Harlem would also be the crucible that forged one of the most notorious gangsters in American history. The nickname Bumpy came from a physical characteristic, a bump on the back of his head. But it was his sharp mind and articulate nature that set him apart from his peers. Despite skipping 2 grades in Charleston Public School, a paradox emerged in Bumpy's life. He never finished high school. This fact was a source of shame for him, given his family's emphasis on education. His first brush with the law came at the tender age of 10, indirectly involving his older brother Willie in a crime that pushed his family to move to Harlem. This move marked a significant turn in Bumpy's life. Harlem was different, tougher, and it demanded a different set of survival skills. At 14, Bumpy encountered the harsh realities of his new neighborhood. A schoolyard confrontation turned into a friendship and eventually a life of crime. Bumpy's intelligence and leadership qualities soon became apparent. He was a natural leader and quickly became the brain of his group, recognizing the potential in offering protection to local businesses. Bumpy's criminal activities started to gain momentum. Alongside figures like Bob Hewlett, a fearsome gangster, Bumpy ventured into the world of extortion and robbery. They expanded their protection. Services to grocery store owners, restaurant proprietors, and then to the owners of speakeasies and illegal gambling dens. It was during this time that Bumpy's path crossed with Stephanie St. Clair, a prominent figure in Harlem's gambling scene. Impressed by his skills, she hired him as her personal bodyguard, a move that elevated Bumpy's standing in the criminal underworld. The 1920s were a pivotal decade for Bumpy. His activities now included not just protection rackets, but also controlling the lucrative numbers game in Harlem. This was a time when Harlem was bustling with energy, jazz music filled the air, and illegal activities were the norm. Bumpy, with his strategic mind and fierce loyalty, became a respected and feared figure. However, Bumpy's rise was not without challenges. The Italian Mafia, seeing the lucrative opportunities in Harlem, began to encroach on his territory. This led to a series of confrontations with figures like Dutch Schultz, a notorious gangster who wanted a piece of the Harlem pie. Bumpy's resistance against Schultz and the Italian Mafia was not just a battle for control, but also a symbolic fight for the rights and dignity of the African-American community. Incarceration became a recurring theme in Bumpy's life. Arrests and prison sentences were common, but each stint behind bars only seemed to strengthen his resolve and reputation. Upon his release in the early 1930s, Bumpy found himself at a crossroads. The battle against Schultz had escalated, and Harlem was a war zone. Bumpy's strategy, intelligence, and sheer willpower became key in navigating these treacherous waters. Throughout these struggles, Bumpy's vision for Harlem was clear. He saw himself as more than a gangster. He was a custodian of his community, fighting against external forces that threatened to undermine the autonomy and respect of its residents. His tactics were questionable, but his intent was to keep Harlem for the Harlemites. The schoolyard scrapper, early life and formative years. The story of Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, like many tales of legends, begins humbly. Born in the segregated South of Charleston, South Carolina, his life was a stark portrait of the era's racial divide. Yet, it was these early years that laid the foundation for the man he would become. A resilient fighter, a shrewd thinker, and a figure of authority in the chaotic world of Harlem. Charleston, in the early 1900s, was a place steeped in racial tensions and economic disparities. Growing up, Bumpy witnessed firsthand the harsh realities of being African American in a segregated society. His family, though modest, was a bastion of respect and religious fervor within their community. This environment instilled in young Bumpy values of respect, community, and the significance of standing up for one's rights. The move to Harlem was a pivotal moment in Bumpy's life. The vibrant yet volatile streets of this New York neighborhood were a far cry from the relative calm of Charleston. Harlem in the 1920s was a cauldron of cultural, social, and political activity. It was a place where the Harlem Renaissance was blossoming, bringing with it a surge of African-American art, music, and literature. But beneath this cultural awakening was a world of crime, poverty, and racial injustice. Elements that would significantly influence Bumpy's path. Bumpy's early life in Harlem wasn't easy. He encountered hostility and discrimination not just from the wider society, but even within his own community. On his very first day of school in Harlem, a mere 2 blocks from his destination, he faced aggression from a group of local youths. The confrontation quickly escalated, and Bumpy found himself in a physical altercation. This incident was a turning point. It marked the beginning of his reputation as a fighter, someone not to be trifled with. This reputation as a tough individual was further solidified when he dropped out of school. Despite his intelligence and academic potential, the harsh realities of his environment and the need to support his family took precedence. Bumpy's education in the School of Hard Knocks began on the streets of Harlem, where he learned the rules of survival and power in a world where the odds were often against him. It was during these formative years that Bumpy's natural leadership qualities began to surface. He had a charisma that drew people to him and a strategic mind that saw opportunities where others saw challenges. He began to form alliances with other young men in the neighborhood, forming a group that would engage in various activities to make ends meet. These activities ranged from benign tasks like sweeping sidewalks for local businesses to more dubious endeavors such as gambling and petty theft. What set Bumpy apart was not just his physical strength, but his mental acuity. He had a knack for understanding the intricacies of street life and navigating its dangers. He knew when to fight and when to negotiate, when to lead and when to follow. These skills were crucial in an environment where respect and reputation were as valuable as any currency. Bumpy's early encounters with crime were a mix of necessity and opportunity. He and his group started offering protection services to businesses in Harlem. This venture was Bumpy's first step into organized crime. His understanding of the dynamics of Harlem's streets made him an effective leader in this new role. He had a unique ability to mediate disputes, enforce agreements, and ensure that local businesses could operate without fear of interruption for a price. During these years, Bumpy also came into contact with prominent figures in the Harlem underworld. One such figure was Bob Hewlett, a notorious gangster. Their initial confrontation over protection rights for a local store led to a mutual respect and an eventual partnership. This alliance would be a significant step in Bumpy's ascent in Harlem's criminal hierarchy. As he navigated the complexities of street life, Bumpy's reputation grew. He was respected, feared, and in some circles, revered. His ability to balance aggression with intellect, violence with strategy, set him apart from his peers. He wasn't just another gangster. He was a tactician, a thinker, a rarity in the brutal world of street crime. Entering the underworld, Bumpy's initial forays into crime. The labyrinthine streets of Harlem, humming with the energy of the Jazz Age, were the perfect backdrop for the emergence of a figure who would soon be synonymous with the neighborhood's underworld. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson. His foray into the criminal world was not a sudden plunge, but a gradual immersion, shaped by circumstances and a keen understanding of Harlem's unspoken rules. As Bumpy navigated his teenage years, the need for survival in the tough streets of Harlem became increasingly urgent. The economic hardships of the era, coupled with the social challenges of being African American in a segregated society, pushed Bumpy towards avenues that, while risky, promised quick returns. It was during this time that he first tasted the seductive allure of easy money, an allure that would shape much of his life. Bumpy's initial steps into crime were small-scale playing dice, hustling on street corners, and running minor scams. These activities might have seemed inconsequential, but they were crucial in building his reputation and honing his skills. The street was his classroom, and every interaction, every deal, every confrontation was a lesson. He quickly learned the art of reading people, of negotiation, and of asserting his presence in a world where respect was hard-earned. One of the pivotal moments in Bumpy's early criminal career was his involvement in the numbers game, an illegal lottery popular in African American communities. The numbers game was not just gambling, it was a community institution, a form of economic empowerment, and a symbol of defiance against a system that offered few legitimate opportunities for wealth creation. Bumpy's intelligence and charisma made him a natural in this world. He started off as a runner, collecting bets and delivering payouts, but his ambition and sharp mind quickly propelled him up the ranks. As Bumpy's involvement in the numbers game grew, so did his understanding of the broader criminal landscape of Harlem. He saw how different gangs operated, how protection rackets were run, and how the balance of power was maintained. This understanding led him to expand his activities. He began offering protection services to local businesses, a move that marked his transition from small-time hustler to a more organized form of crime. Protection rackets in Harlem were not just about muscle, they required a delicate balance of intimidation and diplomacy. Bumpy excelled in this. He had a way of commanding respect without resorting to unnecessary violence. Business owners, while wary of the need to pay for protection, often found in Bumpy a respectful and reliable guardian against the more predatory elements of the underworld. Bumpy's rise in the criminal hierarchy of Harlem also brought him into contact with more established figures in the underworld. One such figure was the notorious gangster Bob Hewlett. Initially rivals, their relationship evolved into a partnership that would significantly bolster Bumpy's position in Harlem. Through this alliance, Bumpy gained access to a broader network of criminal activities and began to exert more control over various illegal enterprises in Harlem. The 1920s and 1930s were a time of profound change in Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance was in full swing, bringing with it a celebration of African American culture. Parallel to this cultural awakening was the growth of organized crime, fueled by Prohibition and the economic struggles of the Great Depression. Bumpy, with his blend of intelligence, charisma, and street smarts, found himself at the center of this tumultuous world. As Bumpy's influence grew, so did his wealth and power. He started dressing more sharply, frequenting Harlem's famous nightclubs, and mingling with celebrities. But beneath this veneer of success, the dangers of his chosen path were ever present. Rivalries with other gangsters, clashes with law enforcement, and the inherent risks of illegal activities were constant threats. Yet Bumpy navigated these challenges with a mix of shrewdness and bravado. The Queen of Numbers and the Italian Challenge, Stephanie St. Clair and Dutch Schultz. In the intricate tapestry of Harlem's criminal underworld, two figures stood out in the 1920s and 1930s, Stephanie St. Clair, the formidable Queen of Numbers, and Dutch Schultz, the ruthless Italian gangster. These two, along with Bumpy Johnson, formed a triad of power, ambition, and conflict that would leave an indelible mark on the history of Harlem. Stephanie St. Clair, an immigrant from the French Caribbean, emerged as a leading figure in Harlem's numbers racket. Commanding, intelligent, and fiercely independent, she ran her operation with an iron fist, earning the respect and fear of her peers. St. Clair wasn't just a gangster. She was a community advocate and a symbol of female empowerment in a male-dominated underworld. Her role in Harlem was more than that of a criminal. She was a benefactor, often using her wealth to support community initiatives and fight against police corruption. Bumpy Johnson's association with Stephanie St. Clair was a pivotal chapter in his life. St. Clair, recognizing Bumpy's intelligence and leadership qualities, brought him into her fold, initially as a bodyguard and later as an advisor and enforcer. This partnership was mutually beneficial. For Bumpy, it was an opportunity to learn from and align with one of Harlem's most influential figures. For St. Clair, Bumpy's muscle and strategic mind were invaluable assets in her ongoing battle to maintain control of her empire. The world of Harlem's illegal lottery was lucrative, and such profitable ventures rarely go unnoticed. Enter Dutch Schultz, a prominent figure in the Italian Mafia and a man with a reputation for brutality and ruthlessness. Schultz set his sights on Harlem's numbers game, determined to take over St. Clair's operation. His methods were straightforward and brutal: intimidation, violence, and bribery. Schultz's ambition set the stage for a bloody conflict that would engulf Harlem. The battle lines were drawn. On one side was Stephanie St. Clair, a powerful, established figure in Harlem's underworld, with Bumpy Johnson by her side. On the other was Dutch Schultz, a man with the backing of the Italian Mafia and a willingness to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. This conflict was more than just a turf war. It was a struggle for the soul of Harlem, a fight between an established African-American enterprise and the encroaching influence of the Italian Mafia. Bumpy, loyal to St. Clair, found himself in the thick of this battle. His role was crucial. As a strategist and enforcer, he orchestrated the defense of St. Clair's operations, employing a mix of guerrilla tactics and direct confrontations. Under his leadership, St. Clair's operation resisted Schultz's advances, maintaining a significant portion of their territory and influence. The war with Schultz was a testing ground for Bumpy's leadership skills and his commitment to the Harlem community. He saw Schultz's attempts not just as a business rivalry, but as an assault on the autonomy and respect of Harlem's African-American community. Bumpy's resistance to Schultz's incursions earned him the admiration and support of many in Harlem, further solidifying his reputation as a defender of his community's interests. This conflict was not without its costs. The constant battles, the police crackdowns, and the internal struggles within Harlem's criminal world took their toll on all involved. St. Clair, despite her resilience and strategic acumen, found herself increasingly cornered by Schultz's relentless pursuit. It was during this tumultuous period that the landscape of Harlem's underworld began to shift, with the balance of power constantly in flux. The war between St. Clair and Schultz eventually reached a boiling point, resulting in increased violence and instability in Harlem. Bumpy, ever the tactician, navigated these turbulent waters with a blend of pragmatism and loyalty. His alliance with St. Clair, though strained at times, remained intact, a testament to their mutual respect and shared goals. Bumpy versus the Mafia, the power struggles of Harlem. The streets of Harlem in the mid-20th century were not just a cultural melting pot, but a battleground where power, respect, and survival were constantly at stake. This era saw the rise of one of Harlem's most iconic figures, Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, as he navigated and contested the Mafia's encroaching influence on his territory. The Italian Mafia, an organization with deep roots and extensive power, eyed Harlem not just for its profitability but also as a strategic foothold in New York City. This presented a direct challenge to Bumpy Johnson, who saw the Mafia's interest in Harlem as a threat to his community's autonomy and his own position of power. The ensuing struggle was not just a clash of criminal empires, but also a cultural and racial conflict, with Bumpy defending the interests of the African-American community against the predominantly Italian Mafia. Bumpy's opposition to the Mafia was characterized by both direct confrontations and strategic alliances. He understood that in the complex web of organized crime, brute force alone was insufficient. To this end, he utilized his intelligence and street savvy to negotiate, form alliances, and, when necessary, engage in violent confrontations. His approach was a delicate balancing act, ensuring that his actions did not provoke an all-out war with the Mafia, which would have had devastating consequences for Harlem. One of the key figures in this power struggle was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, a leading Mafia boss. Luciano, recognizing Bumpy's influence and control in Harlem, sought to negotiate with him. These negotiations were a high-stakes game of chess, with both parties trying to maximize their gains while maintaining a semblance of order in the criminal underworld. Bumpy, aware of the delicate nature of these talks, navigated them with a mix of assertiveness and diplomacy. The power struggles in Harlem were not just about control of illegal activities, they were deeply intertwined with the social fabric of the neighborhood. Bumpy's fight against the Mafia was seen by many in Harlem as a stand against external control and exploitation. This perception was bolstered by Bumpy's efforts to support and protect his community, often using his resources to provide for those in need. His role as a community protector earned him respect and loyalty, which were critical in his ongoing battle with the Mafia. Bumpy's strategy in dealing with the Mafia also involved playing different factions against each other. The Mafia was not a monolithic entity. It had its internal rivalries and conflicts. Bumpy exploited these divisions to his advantage, forging temporary alliances and pitting rivals against one another. This approach required a deep understanding of the Mafia's internal dynamics and a keen sense of timing. The power struggles of this era were marked by a series of skirmishes, negotiations, and alliances that constantly shifted the balance of power. Bumpy's ability to hold his ground against the Mafia was a testament to his leadership, strategic thinking, and the loyalty he commanded among his followers. He was not just a gangster, he was a leader who understood the importance of community and the need to protect it from external threats. Bumpy's confrontations with the Mafia also brought him into the crosshairs of law enforcement. He was a man walking a tightrope, managing the dangers from both the Mafia and the police. His numerous arrests and incarcerations were a reflection of this perilous path. Yet each time he emerged from prison, his reputation and influence in Harlem seemed only to grow. Prison, power, and politics, the incarceration years. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson's life was a paradoxical blend of power and incarceration, a narrative where the walls of prison frequently interrupted his reign over Harlem. These stints behind bars were not mere pauses in his life. They were chapters that furthered his legend, influenced his network, and showcased his resilience. Bumpy's first significant prison term came in the late 1920s, marking the beginning of a pattern that would recur throughout his life. Incarceration was a reality for many in the criminal underworld, but for Bumpy, it became a rite of passage that only bolstered his reputation on the streets of Harlem. Behind bars, Bumpy was not just a prisoner, he was a leader, a mentor, and at times, a mediator. His intelligence and charisma translated well within the prison walls, earning him respect from both inmates and, occasionally, the prison staff. Prison life in the early to mid-20th century was brutal and dehumanizing, yet Bumpy navigated this world with the same acumen he displayed on the streets. He used his time in prison to build networks, gather information, and plan future strategies. His stints in various penitentiaries, including the infamous Alcatraz, were interspersed with periods of freedom where he would return to Harlem to resume control. During his incarcerations, Bumpy's influence in Harlem remained intact. His absence created a power vacuum that was often filled by his trusted lieutenants, who ensured that Bumpy's operations continued smoothly. This continuity was a testament to the organizational structure Bumpy had built and the loyalty he commanded among his followers. Even from prison, he managed to exert a degree of control and influence, utilizing messages and intermediaries to communicate his wishes. Bumpy's time in prison also offered him a unique perspective on the African American experience. He witnessed the disproportionate representation of African Americans in the prison system and the systemic inequalities that funneled many into a life of crime. These experiences deepened his understanding of the social dynamics of Harlem and reinforced his role as a protector of his community. Furthermore, Bumpy's incarcerations coincided with significant political and social movements outside the prison walls. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and Harlem was often at the forefront of this struggle. Bumpy's understanding of these dynamics and his ability to navigate both the criminal and political landscapes made him a unique figure in Harlem's history. One of the most significant aspects of Bumpy's incarceration years was his relationship with other notable figures behind bars. His time in Alcatraz, for instance, overlapped with that of Al Capone, one of America's most notorious gangsters. These interactions, while not always amicable, added to Bumpy's mystique, and connected him to a broader narrative of organized crime in the United States. Bumpy's incarcerations were not just periods of confinement, they were opportunities for reflection and growth. He read extensively, delving into literature, philosophy, and history. This self-education further sharpened his mind and equipped him with knowledge that he would later use to his advantage. Bumpy emerged from each prison term not diminished, but rather more determined, more educated, and more respected. His return to Harlem after each stint in prison was often marked by celebrations and a reassertion of his authority. These homecomings were not just about reclaiming his position, they were demonstrations of resilience and a message to both his allies and rivals that Bumpy Johnson was still a force to be reckoned with.